Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's event hosted by the Middle East Institute. This webinar is entitled Voices of the Future, ASDA'A BCW's 2020 Arab Youth Survey. My name is Hafsa Halawa. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute based in London, and I will be moderating today's discussion. ASDA'A BCW recently published its 12th annual edition of the Arab Youth Survey, which examined polling among Arab youth in the Middle East and North Africa, looking to uncover the key obstacles that young people see as they look to the future. Some of the topics covered throughout the survey include challenges related to migration, the economy, gender rights, and political establishment. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome a panel who will present the findings of the survey and together discuss the challenges faced by youth in the Middle East. First, I would like to welcome Dom Bartkus. Dom is the Vice President of BCW and PSB Middle East. Dom is part of the team that leads ASDA'A BCW's annual survey. I'm also pleased to welcome Sunil John. Sunil is the founder of ASDA'A BCW and President of BCW Middle East. Sunil has been the driving force behind the annual Arab Youth Survey since its inception. And finally, I'd like to welcome Shadi Qobati. Shadi is the co-founder and CEO of ADALA, Yemen's leading legal NGO committed to building a new future for Yemen based on the rule of law and human rights. Shadi also serves as the Vice President of the Economic Forum for Sustainable Development and is a master's candidate at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel via the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing us at events@mei.edu. That's events@mei.edu. If throughout the webinar or any time you have any technical issues, please email us on the same address, events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. We'll be looking forward to all of your questions and factor as many as possible into the discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sunil and to Dom to give us a presentation, approximately 15 minutes, on the sort of some of, not all, of the key findings of this year's report. Thank you very much. Over to you both.
Thank you, Hafsa. I'd like to thank you for the kind introductions, and also wanted to thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this webinar to be able to bring the findings over to a larger audience, especially in the United States. Before we go into the findings, I wanted to just explain a couple of things that are differentiate our finding. We started this the survey way back in 2008, and that's the time when polling or reaching out to young Arabs was not a done thing. And one of our key inspirations to be able to do this is because the region was data poor on finding out what this largest demographic of the region is actually looking at. So we went out to speak to them to understand their hopes, their fears, and their aspirations. And to a great extent, we brought those findings to the fore to governments so that they can make better policy decisions, to businesses that can actually make those informed decisions so that they can do the right thing for their target audiences. And of course, there were a number of multilateral institutions that benefit from these findings. I must tell you that when we started this in 2008, nobody gave much attention to these findings until the Arab Spring of 2011. And that's when everybody said, oh, we got to hear the voice of the Arab youth. And I must tell you, since 2011, we have actually got a lot of governments waiting anxiously to look at what is the new survey saying, what's the new finding. And we've always tried to look at trending data, but also brought new data so that we kept the survey with insights that are fresh, that are relevant, and resonate with our target audiences. The second that I wanted to clarify, Hafsa, is that this is an independent survey. We do it from our own financial resources. We do not take any donations or sponsorships from any governments or even public or private institutions. We do that simply because we want to ensure its credibility and its independence all through these years. And that's what we have protected and nurtured this survey over the last 12 years. And then finally, the findings we upload on our website, arabyouthsurvey.com, where you can go and look at findings all the way from 2008 to 2012. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood what this is all about. If I may request, we have a short presentation, Hafsa, where we have chosen about 4 of our top findings, and you can get all of the findings if you go to arabyouthsurvey.com, but we've chosen 4 so we can make which we think are more relevant for your audience today, and then we could have a discussion on it. So if I may request, if that slide presentation could be uploaded, please. So there you are. This year in 2020, which is a very difficult year, as we all know, because of the pandemic, we have themed our study as a voice for change. Before we go into the findings that I had mentioned earlier, I'd request my colleague Dom, who will give you a brief overview of the methodology of the survey, which was conducted by international polling firm, research firm PSB, which is part of the BCW group. Over to you, Dom.
Thank you, Sunil, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So if we move to the next slide, I can quickly take you through the research methodology. This year, we conducted 4,000 interviews across 17 Arab states. It's actually the highest number of countries we went into this year. This year, we added back in Syria, and for the first time, we spoke to young Arabs in Sudan. All of the interviews are done young people ages 18 to 24, and we only speak to country nationals. So, for example, in UAE, there's a large expat population, but we only speak to Emiratis. Same thing in other countries. We have a 50-50% male and female split. We want to make sure that both men and women are equally represented in our sample. And because this year was, like no other year, we did things a bit differently. So we did our main survey in January, and from January 19th to March 3rd, where we did 3,400 face-to-face interviews. And then COVID happened, and we wanted to really measure and better understand the impact of COVID-19 on the region and its youth. So in August, before we released the findings publicly, we went back in and select countries, and we spoke to young Arabs about the impact of COVID-19. So I'll pass it back to Sunil to go through the first finding.
Thank you, Dom. If you go to the next slide, you'll see our first finding, which I think surprised us. And the finding tells us that nearly half young Arabs have considered leaving their country, and 1/3 are more likely to emigrate due to COVID-19. Let me show you the data. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that 2 in 5 young Arabs, 42%, have considered emigrating to another country, including 15% who are actively trying to leave their country. The number is highest, as you can see on the right-hand side. When we look at the 17 countries, we put them in 3 distinct regions because we think there are differences there. You see on the Levant, that's where the maximum number of people are trying to emigrate, 63%. In North Africa, 47%, and much lower in the Gulf. And I think one can understand the Levant sample, we kind of call it the trouble sample, is where most of the conflicts are happening. And that's where people are struggling, their economies are struggling. There is a conflict that's been going on for more than a decade. What do you expect these young 18 to 24 years to do? Because they haven't gone for schooling, they haven't had a proper family life and things like that. And that's why they feel they should go for a new future. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see all of the 17 countries. And as you can look here, I mean, Lebanon, 77% of the sample said they want to immigrate. Libya, 69%. Yemen, 66%. Iraq, 65%. And if you look at the right-hand side, you see the Gulf countries, which much lower, in fact. So that's the first finding. We think it's a very surprising finding. And clearly, if you go to the white paper that we have published on our website, arabyouthsurvey.com, you'll see the reason why they want to go. They clearly stated that is struggling economies in their home countries and corruption within government, which are the two strongest drivers of immigration. So what are these young people saying? That they're saying that they want opportunity, and that's why they're seeking it in foreign lands. A red flag for governments, and also a red flag for a lot of these countries, especially in Europe, where there could be pressure on the border. Next slide talks about our finding, which is very interesting. Something that we've been tracking over several number of years is on personal identity. And here, religion is central to the personal identity of young Arabs, more so than family or nationality. And if you go to the next slide, here we asked a very simple question: which of the following is most important to your personal identity? And here, the religion, nearly 40% said, that's what defines me as an Arab. More so than family and tribe at 19, my nationality at 17, my Arab heritage at 7, or any of the other political beliefs, language, or gender, which is much, much lower. And if you look at the next slide, having looked at this as religion defining them, then we asked the question, which we have asked them last year as well. So the bar charts, the blues are 2019 and the greens are 2020. And we asked the questions, religion plays too big a role in the Middle East. As you can see here, nearly 67%, a huge majority, have agreed to that statement, that religion plays too big a role in Middle Eastern society. And the second question we asked is, the Arab world needs to reform its religious institutions. A little drop from last year, but still 66% agree with that notion. So those are the two findings. If you can go on to the next one, and Dom, could you take us through the next two?
Sure thing. So the third finding we're looking at today is on gender rights. And this is a finding that has truly been, we've been sharing these findings with different audiences, especially outside of the region. This has been the finding that surprises a lot of people, especially in Western countries. And what it's showing is that most young Arab women say they have the same rights as men, but that their work and family responsibilities have increased due to COVID-19. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see, as I previously mentioned, half of our sample is young Arab women. So we wanted to really understand how they feel about their rights. And what this data is showing, if you look at the green on the pie chart, is that 64% of young Arab women across the 17 countries say that men and women in their country have the same rights. And in fact, 11%, or in the dark blue, say that women have greater rights or more rights than men do. And this is one of the, one of the findings that is actually fairly consistent across the three different parts of the region. So if you look at GCC, 71% say women have the same rights, North Africa, 62%, Levant, 60%. So across all three parts of the region, young Arab women feel they have the same or even greater rights than men. And if you move to the next slide, the same notion actually extends to access to quality education and to a lesser degree to employment opportunities. So on the left side, you'll see that 70% of young Arab women across the region say that in their country, getting quality education is the same both for boys and girls. And then if you look on the right side, we ask a question about, is it easier or more difficult or the same in your country for women to get a job or the same professional opportunities? So 52% say men and women have the same professional opportunities. And while it's a drop off from the education, if we probably ask the same question in any country in the world, we would see a similar pattern, that there is a drop off when it comes to professional opportunities. And we've moved to the next slide. We ask a question about the role of women in family. So we ask them, in your opinion, do you think a woman can benefit her family most if she works either part-time or full-time, or if she stays at home? And what we're seeing here is actually a very strong agreement among both young Arab women and young Arab men is in saying that a woman can benefit her family most if she works either full-time or part-time. So 76% of young women say that, and 70% of young men say that. And while this data is not necessarily on the slide, but this actually applies across most of the countries in the region. And, you know, even in, for example, in countries like Saudi Arabia, majority of both women and men say that they agree with this statement. And if we move to the next slide. So we're going from gender rights to foreign relations. And what we're seeing here is that Saudi Arabia, UAE, and US are seen by the region's youth as the three rising powers in the region. The next slide will show, so here we ask two questions. On the right side, the green, on the left side, the green bars, we ask, out of the 4 Arab countries, which of these has increased its influence on the Arab world the most over the past 5 years? And as you can see clearly, Saudi Arabia and UAE are the clear front runners here at 39% and 34%. And then we ask the same question about among non-Arab countries. And as you can see here on the right side, US is seen as by far the most, or its influence in the region rising by far the most than any other non-Arab country. And the next slide will show, we asked about a series of individual countries and how young Arabs perceive those countries. So do they perceive it as an ally or as an enemy of their country? And here you can see that there's quite a bit of variance. So if UAE, for example, 89% of young Arabs view UAE as an ally of their country, 80% say the same thing about Egypt, 78% say the same thing about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Then you go outside the region, the opinions tend to become a bit more polarizing. So China, 73% ally versus 26% enemy. And if you go down to United States, it drops to 56% ally versus 43% saying that it's an adversary of their country. And it's if you look at the full white paper report on our website, you'll see that we've been tracking perceptions of the U.S. over the past five or 6 years, and we have seen some dramatic shifts. So if in 2016, the last year of then President Obama, during the President Obama's administration, a majority of young Arabs viewed U.S. as an ally. It was over 60% who viewed U.S. as an ally. Once President Trump came in and his administration policies started rolling out towards the region, perceptions of the U.S. shifted quite dramatically. But over the past couple of years, they have started to recover, and in 2020 have nearly recovered to the previous levels before President Trump came into power. And those are the 4 findings, and I'll let Sunil give a quick overview.
Thank you, Dom. So when you look at the top findings, we took you through the migration finding. As I said before, is a red flag, because nearly 42%, half of young Arab, 42% have considered leaving their country. And I think the pandemic is actually further heightened or worsened the trend of young people wanting to emigrate. The second one is on religion. I think while religion is central to the personal identity for many young Arabs, more than family and nationality, they still feel that religion plays too big a role in society in the Middle East. The finding on on gender rights, I think the fact that 60+% of the young women polled, as you know, the sample is 50% male, 50% female, felt that they have equal rights as men, I think is a stunning finding. In fact, in my opinion, probably the most important one, because that shows the mindset of this young generation. We've been tracking this finding over the last 12 years, and I can tell you the same question answered 12 years ago, you would see a diametrically opposite answer. And I think that has what is been probably the most important finding for me. And I think this is a huge positive and hopeful finding, because this talks about the region of the future, where young women and men will play an equal part in terms of the next steps in terms of progress and peace and growth in the economies. And finally, foreign relations is a very dynamic area where I think things have changed. I think that if you look at 10, 15 years ago, the capitals of foreign power was in Cairo and Damascus and possibly in Baghdad. And today you're looking at Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and of course the other centers as well. And you're looking at much more foreign powers playing an important role besides US. You're looking at Iran and Russia as well. In fact, China as well to some extent. So that's how the region is changing dramatically. And the last 10 years, Hafsa, you're looking at a region that has dramatically changed. And I think when you look at the young generation, I think a lot of there's been a lot of pressure on the young people. One of our findings about unemployment, the Middle East region has one of the highest unemployment levels in the world, 30%. I mean, if governments and private sector and multilateral organization does not address that huge issue, this problem, this unhappiness and this trends toward migration will continue. But there are a lot of hopeful signs. You're looking at 18 to 24-year-olds. This is youth. There is the exuberance of youth, and you will see a lot in the findings as well. So it's not all gloom and doom. There's a lot of hopeful signs. And that's what I think the final slide is just to tell you that you can spend some time on our website, thearabyouthsurvey.com. You will see a white paper that we published, where we've also invited experts to actually comment on those findings, because you'll see some context. So you have Jihad Azor from the IMF commenting about the findings related to migration or government corruption or protests. And then you have the other findings. So you get a lot of expert comments there, and we look forward to discussing this further. Thank you, Hafsa.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's I encourage everybody to have a deeper look at the survey. I myself have, and it's an incredibly interesting read. I think it does a lot to both challenge some of our entrenched perceptions of the region, but also provide some avenues for us to reconsider certain policy prescriptions or work based on some of the more positive outcomes. Before I open up the floor, and also before I come back to both Dom and Sunil for any sort of concluding remarks, please note that the Q&A function is open for you to submit your questions at any time. But I'd like to go to Shadi and ask and sort of engage you on a couple of questions related to your reaction to the report. I know that you have read through it, and you yourself kind of possibly rather than directly responding to those 2-3 key findings, I know that you were very struck by the questions on education. And so I'd like to ask you, Shadi, for your general but also specific reflection on that as it relates probably to migration, unemployment, the kind of different kind of perception cycles that we see in the region.
Thank you, Hafsa, for bringing us together today, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for making this happen, and thanks to Sunil and Dom for all the wonderful work they do to bring attention to something which is very important and puts empirics to what's happening. I read through the report, and I heard the presentation now, and it's really interesting results, but I would say that I'm not surprised at all. I would say that, for instance, with certain things, I'm actually surprised that it's that low. So, for instance, when it comes to migration, I was surprised that the figure is only 42%. And I think, for people who live in the region, I think this resonates a lot with them. And for me personally, as someone who lived in Yemen, in Lebanon, and in Egypt, I think all of this resonates a lot with me. And it's not those findings aren't surprising at all, especially with the ones to do with migration. But as you mentioned, education is the main factor that kept blinking to me every single time, especially with those first 3 factors, with the 4th factor on foreign relations that has, I guess, to do with politics. But if we focus on the first 3, factors that Sunil and Dom mentioned, I think, education is the key aspect there, because I think within the Arab world, even so, for instance, if we look at what happened, for instance, with the Arab Spring, I think this like brought to light a lot of the things that were happening. But all of the, these things aren't new. Like these things were always, they're always present for at least the last 2 decades. But coming to this point of education, I think it's very undervalued in the Arab world, especially when it comes to the early stages of education and during the formative years. I think that's a huge flaw when it comes to the Arab world, and it links as well with religion to a great extent, and the finding that Dom and Sunil presented, that religion plays a huge role in the Arab world. Like education plays a huge part there. And if I just may elaborate on that point, when you come to the Arab world and you look at how education starts from a very young age, you're not encouraged to do things, looking at creativity, looking at lateral thinking, looking at all those aspects from the formative years, which develop your thinking. Our focus on education in the Arab world tends to be to a great extent for students who are already in their teens, and we're looking at a huge extent on how to get those people to universities. But this is also very much linked to the political will and what we want to create in the Arab world. So we emphasize education at a later stage. And then we also have all those different cultural perceptions on certain, for instance, subjects. So it's a common joke in the Arab world, but as with many of the jokes, there is a lot of crudeness to do with it, where when we look at it in terms of the Arab world, I'm sure Hafsa, you could relate this, you could relate a lot to this, where we have like a tiered systems in terms of graduates from high school, and the national exam. When you graduate, you have 3 stages. You have, I guess, the first class graduates who are always encouraged to go to medical school and to go to engineering. Think of that as the people who score like 95% and over. And then you get like the second class, I guess, who end up going to business school. But the joke there is then the second class who have lower grades on their national exams and go to business school end up having more control than the first class and end up ruling them. Then you come to the third class, where it comes to the social sciences and the humanities. I'm speaking politics, sociology, economics, philosophy, all those key disciplines. Those are the people with the lowest scores, in terms of admission to university. And then those people who graduate from those disciplines end up ruling the prior 2 classes. And then even if you take this to the extreme, the people who can't even enter university are encouraged to go to the military and to the police academies if they don't have a high enough score. And then, those are the people who end up basically controlling the politicians and controlling all the classes. So you have the system in reverse, and you have that has a lot to do with the political will. But, that creates a huge problem, because in terms of, when people are growing up, and if you're like very smart, your parents will straight away tell you go for medicine, go for engineering, as opposed to like those soft sciences and the socials and the humanities, where you really need people when it comes to like developing thought and developing ideas and changing the political perception. And in many of those countries, you're not giving them much of an opportunity, and you just look down on them.
That's very fair. We thank you very much, Shadi. And I think it is not slowly, but generally, I think we're starting to look at more root causes. I think particularly as the region kind of grinds to more of a halt, stagnation within the political processes, inability for youth to break out, both in terms of participation on a social, political level. And we're seeing this attempt, at least, at both in terms of development, but also in terms of political and social engagement, economic engagement, to target education. We are getting quite a stream of questions, so I don't want to take up too much time, and I thank Sunil very much for the broader overview as well. Dom, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions on the methodology before we jump in, and so that I can give the floor to people watching to be able to submit questions. I had 2 comments about the methodology, or questions, I should say. Firstly, one relating to how you either identify or split in terms of socioeconomic sort of level, and how you talk or how you decipher when you're going country to country, how to identify different socioeconomic groups within which to interview. But the other thing as well, in terms of, beyond the findings, the actual process of the survey, have you found maybe this year compared to last year or the last few years, as misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories have raged online, that it's changed the way that your survey is either perceived or changed your ability to access young people to interview for this survey in any way? Have there been any additional challenges in the current climate of misinformation that we live in?
Great questions, and I'll start with the second question, probably because of what's happening in the U.S. right now, and obviously the polling issues, polling challenges that happened during the presidential election. So in this region, in the Middle East, there are no political leaders who are saying that all the polls are fake. So we haven't really faced the challenge of respondents being less likely to engage with our professional interviewers. And one of the things I think important things to note here is that our interviews are done face-to-face. Which is a big difference, especially on the socioeconomic aspect in the region. Unlike in the U.S. and let's say UK or some other parts of Europe, you cannot really reach a representative sample of youth or anyone, a broader population. You cannot reach online because not everyone is online, and for that reason, we're really investing a lot of resources, both in terms of time and financial resources, in making sure that we do face-to-face interviews. So we haven't faced any challenges. And what we have seen actually is that a lot of young people, they're very excited to give their opinions, because it's, we're asking them questions, not just, how do you view, like the government and things, but we talk about different topics that might not necessarily they have been asked about before. So we have talked about mental health issues. We have talked about drug abuse issues. So those are not the topics, let's say, that they get asked about every day. And we get pretty good response rates, and for a lot of people excited to talk. In terms of our sampling plan, so for every country, we have a pretty in-depth sampling plan, making sure that we go to these centers. So we don't just go to capital cities, we go to different cities across the countries. And we want to make sure that, within the cities, that we cover different areas where there might be different socioeconomic or even, let's say, religious affiliations or how they view the government. So we want to make sure that we get very broad perspectives.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that. I want to dive right into the questions. We have some broad-based and some very specific. So if Sunil, I could ask you a question we have on the findings of youth's views and opportunities. Could you expand if there are any findings on youth's views of opportunities provided by their governments within the region, whether that was at all apparent in your study or through questions that you asked?
Yeah, in fact, finding number 5, if you go to our white paper, Hafsa, is related to jobs. And the finding says that unemployment is the top issue and young Arabs are looking beyond traditional jobs. And of course, COVID-19 has made finding a job more difficult, but particularly based on the question that you just asked me, we asked the question, thinking about your future career, would you prefer to work for government, for private sector, or for myself and my family? And we've seen, of course, 43% said they want to work for government. And that's a drop from nearly 50% last year. The working for private sector has also dropped, from 28 to 24%. But 10 years ago, this was like 90% government. So you're seeing a dramatic change. But what is most interesting is the rise from 16% last year to 23% for young people who say, I want to work for myself and my family. And when you put that together, they're looking for more non-traditional jobs. And then we asked the question, do you intend to start your own business within the next 5 years? It's a future perspective. 40% said yes, they intend to start their own business within the next 5 years. And when you look at the region splits, the highest number of the entrepreneurial spirit among young nationals is in the Gulf. 55% said they want to start their own business in the next 5 years, 44% in North Africa, and a much lower but still significant 22% in the Levant. So those are, so the finding really, to answer the question, is there is a definite trend moving away from government, because as you know, Hafsa, the government is maxed out. They cannot create more jobs in government. So clearly the private sector has to play a role. And I think we need to spur the spirit of entrepreneurship for young people to start their own business. And I see a huge trend of young people going into technology jobs and e-commerce jobs and a lot of non-traditional jobs. You know, as Shadi said, you know, tier 1 is all about go to medical school or engineering school. You know, I think that's changing. I think social sciences and being a business person and working for yourself is a huge trend, and that's a great positive sign.
Thank you so much. Dom, a couple of very specific questions for you as well. One is on Palestinian Arab youth and whether the report was able to determine whether or not they are more or less adamant about reclaiming what is historic Palestine than, say, previous years, or than, you know, maybe whether or not we have reflections on that in relation to ELDA or other broader surveys on the issue. I'm not sure if there was a specific question on that in the report. And the other, also very country specific, we have a query about the fact that Lebanese seem to be looking to immigrate at a higher level than countries like Syria and Yemen. Were you able to establish any specific reason, or maybe some reasoning behind why the numbers in Lebanon would be higher than the conflict countries such as Syria or Yemen?
Sure. So in terms of the first question, so because this is a regional study, we usually don't necessarily ask country specific questions. We ask about regional questions. We have asked a question about because we asked about a series of, issues, how concerned they are, just to measure the level of concern different from unemployment. So one of the issues we ask about is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how concerned they are. And across the region, you have seen that, you know, the level of concern has started to decline among young Arabs, that a lot of them are more concerned about, you know, getting a job, finishing their education, and, you know, rather than the big geopolitical issues. So that's on that. And then in terms of the Lebanon, for us, it's not very surprising. It's in my personal view would be, you know, it's even in the countries where there are conflicts, there are two sides fighting and there are two sides proposing different views. I think in Lebanon, what we're seeing is that you've just given up on everyone, and they just don't feel like whoever comes into power, they won't really see any change. And, you know, I would just call attention to the timing of our survey. So we did it in January. The main survey took place from January to March. So it was, you know, as the protests were still going on, and, you know, things are not looking great for Lebanon. So to us, it's not very surprising. And in the COVID-19 pulse survey that we did in August, which was actually conducted right after the awful Beirut explosion, we saw that, you know, the perceptions among Lebanese youth got even worse in how they perceive the government in their own opportunities.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that issue. And Shadi, more of a question of your reflection on the question of religious identity. We have a question here. The importance of religious identity and the need for religious reform also could offer great opportunity for more conflict. Do you agree? And if so, or if not, why?
That's an interesting question. I mean, unfortunately, when it comes to religion, it could be used by many factions to meet their own ends, and we've seen this, more and more, especially when you're looking at certain conflicts. And what Dom was mentioning, vis-a-vis Lebanon, when it comes to perception, perception is everything, from my perspective, because, for instance, if you're looking at the conflict in Yemen, many people shape it as if it's a Sunni Shi'i divide. And as soon as people start believing that that's the way, and you have many players who want to push it in that direction, want to make it seem as if it's a sectarian divide, because it's a very easy way to square the circle and be able to draw comparisons with what's happening in Lebanon and what's happening with other Arab countries. So yeah, I think like religion is a double-edged sword and could be used in a way which could end up hurting people. But I think that as well comes back to education, because even if you look at countries historically, like even here in the United Kingdom, if you're looking at Cambridge and Oxford, those were institutes for theology to start with. And what happens in many countries when literacy levels are very low is people from a very young age, instead of going to school and learning about the sciences and learning about social sciences, more or less the background you get is mostly into religion. So you grow up thinking that that's the only way to think about certain issues, and that links to the point I was speaking about, the importance of getting many people out of that gap, and links with things as well like gender rights, which Sunil and Dom mentioned as one of their 4 key findings. You come to a country like Yemen, not many people know that Yemen is #1 in the world when it actually comes to the differences in literacy rates between men and women, huge disparities, and that ends up having many consequences, because instead of many of those people becoming literate and going to school, where you kind of like increase the base level of education, we tend to focus more on people who are teenagers and people at beyond their formative years, and we try and help them by pushing them to education, and then it's kind of like we're looking at it from when it's already a bit late, when you have to start and strike at it right from the foundation. So I think religion is very, very much related to education in that regard.
Thank you so much, Shadi. We have a couple of other religion questions, but I really want to move to some of the gender questions, because it seems that really is the finding, and I'm grateful to the audience for putting it on the top of the agenda. I'm grateful to both of you to highlighting it in the report, but also pleasantly and cautiously optimistic about the findings myself that you've presented today. So maybe less about the report, a couple of maybe thoughts on your reflections personally, Sunil and Dom, and so feel free to answer or not answer depending on what you feel comfortable with. But Dom, if I could ask you this question, can you share a few reflections on how you think the role of women in the region will shift or could shift in progress over the next few years, given the findings of this study, and maybe in comparison to a few years earlier?
Absolutely. I would say for me, as a male, probably the most impactful finding there is that the question about a woman play, how can a woman benefit her family the most? Mm-hmm. And the fact that both women, young women and young men agree that, a woman can benefit her family most if she works part-time or full-time, more so than staying at home. And the fact that this generation of young Arabs believe that, that's the case, that women shouldn't just stay home, that they should participate in an economy. I think that that's a huge impact for a region. If 50%, more than 50% of your population are not participating in the economy, that definitely limits your growth. So to me, that's a very impactful and a very encouraging finding that both young women and men, and as I mentioned in the presentation, across the region, that it's not limited just to GCC, it's, or just certain countries, that it's across the region that young people think that.
Thank you. I agree.
If I may add here, Hafsa, just on the gender rights issue, I think what we are talking about is our perceptions. We are asking these young people that how do they see themselves, and they're saying they have equal rights. But the facts on the ground are pretty are not as rosy as the findings talks about. I mean, for example, when you look at the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, Middle East and North Africa region ranks at the lowest in the world. And as the report says, that it predicts that it takes about 150 years for the gender gap in the Middle East and North Africa to close, if the current rate of progress in these countries. So those are some of the facts on the ground. But having said that, it's the young generation that is coming into the work stream, into society, and this is the mindset they're coming with. Yes. And you're going to see dramatic changes. And I would urge you to when you read, if those who are interested, look at the white paper. And we published a column written by Mina Al-Oraibi, who's the editor of the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi, where she has a contrarian view on the findings. And we publish it because the white paper is a spark for discussion, So, what we are bringing is the voice of the youth, and we are bringing the optimism in that voice as well. But the facts on the ground are different, but it only shows that there's work to be done, Yes. As Shadi talks of education. I mean, honestly, I would like to say that the two things that Arab world needs to do, that policymakers in government need to do, that private sector needs to do, that multilateral organizations, that the World Bank and IMF need to focus on are two things. One is education, and Shadi, truly, that's where, and at the lower levels, so that, you bring a generation that are well skilled for the jobs of the future. There is a very big challenge there. Are young Arabs trained for the jobs of the future? Because if they don't, they're going to lose out in what the new world we are going into, the fourth industrial revolution, the focus on artificial intelligence and coding and technology jobs. And the second is job creation. I think those are the two basic problems that policymakers need to focus on. And this is what we've been talking about for a long time. There's some great action. I think governments are under tremendous amount of pressure to be able to deliver on those fronts. And in many parts of the region, not in all, in many parts of the region, there is some real positive action taking place.
Thank you so much. We have just over 10 minutes, and I do want to, we have 3 more questions to respond to, and then I want to give each of you a minute or two to conclude or provide concluding remarks. So just before I go to you, Shadi, Dom, we have an interesting question, I think, on, it's related to gender progress, but I think, or the perception, as we've discussed, on gender progress, but maybe it relates to other things and the key findings in the report. If they have relation, or they are related at all, to an increased use of social media connecting Arab youth either to each other across the region or youth across the world, and whether you've seen that either as a factor or something that's affecting the responses you're getting.
It definitely could be a factor, and it's, just thinking over the past 12 years of the changes we have seen in our data, the rise of social media has been one of the most significant findings and significant changes. It truly, even if you go, let's say 6 or so years ago, only a small portion of young Arabs said they were getting their news from social media, and TV was the dominant, channel for news. Now, so I think 6 years ago, it was only like 26% or so. If you look this year, 5 years later, it's about 80% or so of young Arabs who say they get their news from social media. While TV has remained fairly stable, the social media just really, shot there up. And so huge change, and obviously not just news, but how they spend their time, what are their influences they're getting, so definitely a big change, and definitely could have something to do with the changing perceptions on gender and gender progress, definitely.
Thank you so much, Dom. And Shadi, a couple of questions for you just before we sort of wrap up. One specifically on an inverse relationship between educational attainment and political power. Do you think it holds true throughout the Arab region, or does it vary by country to country? And the last question, just moving back to religion, sorry, I'll actually pose that to Sunil because it's one specific to the report, but Shadi, go ahead.
Yeah, that's another very interesting question. I think for the most part, it holds across the Arab world. Of course, we cannot generalize because there's a plethora of factors that impact this. So it's not a simple correlation, and of course, the impact of colonialism as well plays very, very closely to this. So, for instance, if you look at a country like Egypt and you look at the 40s and the 50s, it's not hard to notice that the level of education back then on the global world, like Cairo University was one of the top universities in the world, and you could see that things declined since then. So it's not just a complete inverse relationship, but I think it brings a very important point to the forefront on the importance of political will. I think everything has to do with political will, and Sunil mentioned the importance of policymakers, having, making an impact. But the reason why I say it has to do with political will is we see, not just in the Arab world, all around the world, we see an increasing level of mistrust in government, and we see that as well in the rise of the far right in Europe, and with Trumpism as well in the US. So there's a mistrust in government, and even with us in the Arab world, when it comes to wasta, or the ability for you to obtain a job based on some form of meritocracy, you see that many of the jobs within the public sector are being given to people who have those connections and people who have those relations. And that's one of the main reasons why people are distancing themselves away from the public sector and are moving towards entrepreneurism and moving towards businesses and moving towards venture capital and trying to make a living given the resources they have, because there is mistrust. So there has to be real political will in terms of implementing education from an early stage. And then the second point I want to just come to very quickly, Hafsa, is perception is really is everything. And I think closely related as well to the question that was asking about this inverse relationship. If you perceive that it's possible for us to change in the Arab world, and it's possible for us to even match the West with things when it comes to like gender equality, and many of those factors, then suddenly you break a psychological barrier. I think a main problem is within many of the Arab states, we think we look up to the West and we're like, oh wow, look, independent judiciary, democracy, meritocracy, all those S's we keep on associating. And yeah, of course we have to be self-critical and we have to tell ourselves how can we improve in the region, but at the same time we have to look at history, exactly how it happened. So if I could just draw a very quick example when it comes to gender equality, and Sunil mentioned that one of the reports mentioned that the Arab world needs 150 years in order to have some form of gender equality. I think it will be one, much quicker than that, and two, we don't have to go very, very far. If we look even at a country as Switzerland, we always forget that it took them up until 1971 to get female suffrage. So in terms of the equal vote that was done in the referendum, and up until 1991, 2 cantons did not allow women to vote in local elections. So when we come and we think about these concepts of democracy and meritocracy, we tend to look up to certain countries as if they've always had it. No, they didn't always have it. Even countries like the UK, when you look at it post-industrial revolution, a lot of those policies were implemented by Disraeli and by Gladstone, and in terms of introducing meritocracy to the civil service, into the army, these things were done within the last 100, 150 years, 200 years. So it is doable. We shouldn't, because I think if we just look up to some of those countries and be like, oh, wow, how they have all of these things, and assume that they've always had it, then that pushes us a step backward, because we always think that the only way out of this is for us to migrate and leave our home country. So I think perception is very important when it comes to us psychologically breaking that barrier and thinking, no, this is something that we can achieve in our own countries.
Thank you, Shadi. I'm struck by the fact that we're not that different, or there's not as big a gap between us in age, and yet you express so much more optimism than I've had in recent years. So I appreciate that, and especially coming from Yemen, of all the countries in the region. Considering the time, I think I'd rather just leave the last few minutes to you, Sunil, and then Dom, just to provide your concluding remarks, whether it's something from the report, something from the questions you've received in this discussion, or something that is a discussion point in your engagement with your partners with whom you're sharing this report, and sort of leave us with your final thoughts on this. So Sunil, go ahead.
Thank you, Hafsa. This has been a passion project for us since 2008, and we have nurtured this product over the last 12 years because it is very important that the voice of the youth come up to the fore. And I think to a great extent, we have been able to do that because of the fact that the region went through this turmoil and continues to do so in the last 10 years. I think it is important for the world to understand that anybody with a stake in the Middle East need to understand its largest demographic. I think understanding the Middle East is understanding what these young minds, what their hearts and minds are thinking about, not only about their past, but their present and their future. The hopes, fears, and aspirations that we bring out is extremely critical, not just to governments in the region, but to everyone, to a global audience. And to a great extent, we have been able to do this to get a better understanding of the region. It has opened the eyes of many, many people. But the truth of the matter, as I said earlier, I said the two things that this report has consistently brought about is the need to focus on relevant education systems. And second is on the focus on job creation. These are two critical problems. We can talk about all of this come from that real root of the problem, whether it's your migration or protests. What are these anti-government protests all about that is driven by youth? It's all about asking for opportunity. And I think it's about time that the youth dividend pays off for the region.
Thank you so much, Sunil, and very important points. I think we forget about the size of the demographic, or sometimes we pretend like it isn't already as large as it is. Dom, please go ahead.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for having us and for allowing us to share this report. As Sunil mentioned, it has truly been a passion project for us. For me, I'm kind of looking actually forward to the next year and our next study. And I'm actually very intrigued to see what the COVID-19 impact has been. While we did the COVID-19 pulse survey in August, and what we saw is that things that are already bad got even worse. So if youth are having difficulty finding a job, now 70% say it has become even more difficult to find a job. 20% say they or someone in their family has lost a job due to COVID-19. So what does that do to a region? What does that do to the region's youth? What does that do to the region's youth perceptions of the government and what the government is allowed to do, what the government is not allowed to do? How has the government delivered for its young people? And how do the regional economies and different country economies recover from this, global disruption, this global recession? So I'm very intrigued to see what impact this unprecedented event has had in where the region goes and how the region recovers.
It's a very important point, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see the results that come out of next year's survey for sure. Shadi, you requested 30 seconds, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have the last word before we close this down.
Thank you, Hafsa. I think Sunil just reminded me of a very important point of understanding the region as it is and giving agency to people on the ground. When we look at gender rights, for instance, it was from that study, it says 2/3 of women say that they have the same rights as men, and I think we should look at it from there as it stands in the region, as opposed to having our own views, which are tend to be influenced with other things and could be very Eurocentric. If a woman wants to stay at home and wants to care for her children, that's just as good as going out and working. They're not oppressed. They're not forced to stay at home. They could be making a choice, and we should just give them that agency.
Thank you. And on that note, and I think Shadi ends on an incredibly important note, thank you to you, Sunil and Dom, for giving that agency. I think this survey, this report is an incredibly important tool, and the literature that's come from it is doing just that, which is something we continue to advocate for, which is providing and giving agency back to those people in the region, whether it's to dispel stereotypes or just to provide space for their voices to be heard, and for our own work, whether it's in advocacy, development or policy work to reflect the will of people, and particularly this very large youth demographic. I thank the three of you very much for taking the time. I know in Dubai it's already quite late in the evening, so I appreciate your time. Shadi, the sun has gone away while we're talking in Cambridge, so apologies that you missed your last hour of daylight. Thank you to everybody joining us. Of course, to everyone, stay safe, stay healthy. Wish you all well, and getting this close to the holidays, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you to MEI for inviting me and for hosting this very interesting webinar. The recording should be up on the MEI webpage when this webinar concludes. Thanks to everybody.